Hey there, Brandon Harvey here. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to the sponsor of this week's episode, Who Gives a Crap? No, really though, that's the name of the company, Who Gives a Crap. Who Gives a Crap began when its Australian founders learned that 2.3 billion people across the world don't have access to a toilet. That's roughly 40% of the global population and means that around 289,000 children under 5 die every day from diarrheal diseases caused by poor water and sanitation. So they did what anyone would do in this situation and started a toilet paper company. Yes, that's what they did. Not only do they make all of their products with environmentally friendly materials, but they also donate 50% of their profits to help build toilets and improve sanitation in the developing world. Who Gives a Crap is offering Sounds Good's listeners $10 off their first order with the promo code SOUNDSGOOD. To get toilet paper delivered to your door, make a difference in the world, and support this podcast, just go to whogivesacrap.org/soundsgood and use the discount code SOUNDSGOOD. All one word. One more time, that is whogivesacrap.org/soundsgood with the discount code SOUNDSGOOD. Who Gives a Crap? Good for your bum, great for the world. All right, now here comes the show. In an Instagram post from March 10th, Miles Adcox shared these words. Conflict and intimacy are two things I see men avoid the most. I did for years and worked hard to improve both professionally and relationally. We also struggle owning and addressing symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression. It's not in our nation to admit flaws or any perceived weakness. The good news is that things are starting to change for the better. When I first read these words, they immediately hit home for me because I knew Miles was onto something that's missing in this conversation around the collective movement towards empathy. Miles Adcox has devoted his life to living into these three concepts: empathy over action, love over agenda, and grace over advice. Publicly and privately, he's known as one of the most plugged-in people on human condition that there is today. And that's why I'm so honored that he is my guest on the podcast today. I have so much respect for Miles. He's a speaker, he's a writer, he's the CEO of Onsite, an extended care center for emotional trauma and codependency. And Miles is also a featured guest expert on The Dr. Phil Show and has been featured on The Doctors, Annie's Intervention, and has been interviewed on codependency, emotional wellness, and family dynamics on several national radio shows. I'm Brandon Harvey, and this is Sounds Good. This is the weekly podcast where we have conversations with inspiring people who are rejecting cynicism and using their lives to make an impact. Miles and I had a great conversation about his story, masculinity, and even politics. So without any further ado, let's just dive straight into this conversation. Miles, welcome to the studio. Welcome to Sounds Good.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. We first met earlier this year, I guess, or late 2017. But I've been hearing your name from a number of friends for probably a few years now, mostly in association with their really positive experiences at Onsite. Maybe we could just start off with, can you tell me about what Onsite is? Because I feel like that's just a good spot to start.
Of course, yeah. So we have a 75-bed retreat center, and Onsite would be considered kind of an emotional wellness lifestyle brand, and we offer creative content, but what we're known for is therapeutic and personal growth workshops. So we offer a whole series of workshops about 48 weeks out of the year on a variety of topics. There's one specifically called Living Center program that we're kind of known for. A lot of people, probably our mutual friends, that's usually the first workshop people do.
And is that the one that's like a week long?
It's a week long,
okay.
Kind of just a deep dive on your narrative and figure out what parts aren't working or any areas of your life that feel a little stuck.
Yeah.
And then there's a longer-term residential program for trauma, anxiety, depression. It's a little bit more on the residential mental health side.
Yeah.
So that's Onsite.
Wow. And how long have you been doing Onsite? Did you start Onsite, or are you facilitate it?
So Onsite was around prior to me. It was got a really great lineage and heritage. It was a little bit longer of a name as Onsite Training and Consulting, and they were doing clinical training for therapists with a model called experiential, which is basically making things three-dimensional in a therapeutic context. A lot of therapies just talk therapy, kind of like we're doing. You're speaking into the prefrontal, but a lot of pain is held in the limbic. And so curating and creating experiences is what we're known for, and trying to make people's story come alive visually or kinesthetically so that we activate more parts of their brain and help them rewrite whatever's stuck.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so it used to be a training consulting, and they were doing some workshops, but nobody really knew about them. And I didn't know much about them, but I had a passion and a dream to create something that made the door wider with less stigma for people to lean into their pain and do their own work.
And what year was that?
I started looking at it in 2005.
Wow.
And I was running a long-term residential program at that time, another place called The Ranch, and we were doing addiction and eating disorder treatment.
Yeah.
But I wanted...
Which have bigger stigmas almost.
For sure. And what I learned from the crisis, I would consider that kind of the crisis business, the rehab business, because people come to you and they're kind of at a bottom.
Yeah.
Is I loved it and I learned so much, but it was pretty predictable. You know, people come, you do your best you can with them, and then you support them going back out. But I thought the rest of the world needs access to this kind of opportunity, whether the wheels are falling off or not. And that's what I wanted to create, was something that that didn't have as much stigma, and you didn't have to be at a bottom to come take a look at your story. So I started playing with the idea of what would that look like, and I thought it was going to be a seminar business initially. And then it's a long story, but ultimately I came together with the people that had it at the time. They were looking for a succession plan. It was small, 2007. So I bought it with a partner, and I thought I was going to rebrand it because I didn't have a lot of attachment to Onsite and the origin of it, other than the lineage was great. But honestly, I couldn't afford to. We got 2007, 8, 9 were tough.
Yeah, those are not good years to buy a business.
Terrible time to buy a business. And so I didn't poke my head back up into the black until like 10. And then once we got there, we've really just been fortunate. I think part of it was just good programming, and part of it was trending. You know, a lot of people are interested in doing it.
Well, and the stigma really has gone away largely. There's still a stigma there, but I started therapy maybe close to 2 years ago now when I moved to Nashville, or at least a little bit after I got married. And if it wasn't for the people before me who had basically just broken down that stigma for me, just saying, oh, I go to therapy, my wheels didn't fall off, I wanted to grow, I wanted to understand myself better, you know, that was a game changer. Just them kind of offering that encouragement and that personal experience. And now you can do that through the internet. You know, I know so many people. I saw somebody today just tweet, hey, just went to therapy for the first time today, and why did it take so long? You know, things are kind of changing, and that's exciting. They're
really exciting. We've kind of been waiting on that for a long time, hoping the world would begin to embrace therapy, and we could rebrand the idea of looking at your pain as it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's right with you, that you take a deeper look at your narrative.
That's so interesting. And that, in many ways, I was telling this before the show, kind of how the show got started, and about how I did not know that we would be talking about so much pain on this podcast when we started, but it's been so interesting that the people that I most admire, who I want to have conversations with on this show, have a unique ability to look at the pain in their life and not freak out, not let it completely overwhelm them, not let it bring them to become cynical, but to just see it for what it is and just kind of grow through that. What kind of person's attracted to that? You know, is it anybody can be, or is there a certain kind of person that's going after that?
Historically, it's mostly been positioned, just therapy or counseling in general, for people when they need it. And I think now people are starting to shift that to, it's not that you need it, it's that you deserve it.
Ooh.
And when people start embracing that, it becomes a privilege and an opportunity versus an obstacle or a challenge. So I think now we're starting to see not just people who are stuck, struggling, or who'd experienced adverse childhood experiences in some way. I mean, we all experience adversity at some point along the spectrum, and you have to unpack that, because if you don't take a look at stress, it's going to compound, and that's typically what therapy is. It's a way to offload stress.
That's so interesting. And so what kind of people are showing up at Onsite? Like who's the type of person you're seeing?
pretty much everybody across the spectrum. I mean, we definitely have a sophisticated clinical model, but I usually don't like to talk through the lens of pathology because I think that's part of the problem that created the stigma is over-pathologizing people's process and over-identifying with your pain. And what happens when this happens to a lot of people that are in recovery, happens to people in faith too. People over-identify with their Christianity and they learn this new language, which is I speak Christian. And there's a whole nother group of people out there that don't speak that.
Yeah.
And it turns into where it kind of excludes people unconsciously. And the same thing can happen in the recovery and therapy worlds where I've had people that are in recovery that come, let's say they're in AA, they're in recovery for alcoholism, and they'll come to do a workshop because they never resolved the trauma. And the first thing we do is have to figure out how we support them in learning that they're actually more than their recovery story. In other words, there is more to your identity than your pain.
Interesting.
Because people sometimes will lead out with, before they even know their name, it's like, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict. It's like, well, hold on. I know that's part of your story, but who else are you?
And that's hard to get past, too, because that's so interesting to think about. Because it is an important part of somebody's story. It is probably a huge growing point. It's probably the catalyst for change. How do you separate that, but still not ignore that pain?
The more you go into your story, the more self-awareness you get. The more self-awareness you get, the more you're able to do it with a little bit of grace. And it gets to where the pain doesn't go away, but you create a different relationship with the pain. And when you're able to do that, I think you can dance into the narrative more. And the more that you do, you're able to separate it. And because even today, I think a lot of people would think, not a lot of people, but some people affiliate me with obviously the face of Onsite. So they assume I'm the head of an emotional healing treatment center. I must have my stuff together. And some are surprised, the ones that know me aren't, to understand that I am human and I'm a mess like everybody else. But I have a pretty good relationship with my struggle and my pathology, and I'm constantly working on it. It's not working on me because I don't walk around and look at it through the lens of how could you idiot, get your stuff together. It's like, no, you're human. Of course you're going to be a mess.
That's so interesting. And maybe that's kind of a nice segue to bringing it back a little bit further. And, so before Onsite, you were working at a different location. What were you doing before you even chose this whole path? What kind of led you to this route of life? Because this is certainly a choice.
Well, it was a choice. It ultimately, it chose me. I just had to embrace it and decide that I was going to do it as a career. I was in the sports industry right out of graduate school.
Really?
Yeah, and we were doing kind of the media and business side of sports, broadcasting and selling TV and radio for collegiate properties. And
fascinating.
Yeah, and I liked it, but in a sense, sports was a big identity thing for me. I grew up playing sports, and it was kind of all I knew.
Where did you grow up?
Little small town here in the South, about an hour and a half, a town called Hohenwald. So it sounds like hole in the wall, but it's not. But it's a great town and such amazing people, but there wasn't a lot to do there other than be an athlete and outdoorsman. That was kind of my message of masculinity. We did have some arts, but it wasn't a heavy artistic influence. And so I didn't really get in touch with the rest of me until my early 20s when I had to. But so I get out of grad school, I get into the sports industry, and things are going really well professionally, but personally I was drowning. I was in a career that I wasn't that happy with. It had me, a big part of my career was entertaining. And so I would have to entertain potential clients, which kept you out all hours of the night. And so I was, just numbing out in a lot of unhealthy ways. And what I had on board, and had it for a while that I didn't recognize, was depression. I didn't have a name for it, didn't know what to call it, but ultimately it got the best of me. And it never tripped me up per se professionally, because I had also been educated on put a good face on and keep the walls up. But personally, I was miserable. And finally, the miserable part of what was driving me personally caught up with me. And so long story short, I stumbled through the process of asking for help.
And we don't have to make this short.
Okay.
What was that stumbling process like? Because that's not an easy thing to do.
And I don't want to take credit for it. There were people around me that noticed and spoke into me, my mom being one of them. Can't hide anything from your moms, hide anything from your mom, but she certainly saw it. So I dropped weight and just was really in an unhealthy space. She spoke into me, encouraged me to get help. But the hard part I'm talking about was, one, just the idea of surrender and putting my hands out and say I need help was a big feat. I think people underestimate how hard that is and how powerful it is once it happens. It's such a sacred thing, but we're in a culture where we're conditioned to never do that. That's the last thing you do at all costs. And so it took a lot to do that. And then once you do it, then you've got to navigate, where do I go to get it? Because the helping profession is like any other industry. There's a wide array of talent, and there's a whole bunch of people that probably don't need to be doing it. And you really get lucky if you find a great therapist right out of the gate.
Yeah.
But nobody tells you that. You think it's a one-stop shop. They're all the same. Just pick up the phone. And so I got online or picked up the phone and had a few false starts. Met with some people that I just didn't connect with at all.
That's so discouraging because you don't know other options exist. So you're like, oh, this whole world of things sucks.
Yeah. Almost didn't go back.
Really?
Yeah.
How many did you try before you almost quit?
I think it was 3. It's been a long time.
That's a lot. That's more than most people, I would say, try.
And looking back, I can't put it all on their skill set. I was, struggling at the time.
Well, and it's an alignment thing, They could be great for somebody else.
And then I finally came across kind of the right person at the right time who just set me up on a path once we connected, where the lights came back on. And
wow.
I knew probably 2 weeks into that process that I'd fell in love with change and what that looked like. It was a whole new language and a whole new world that I'd never really embraced. I think my EQ is screaming to come out of the box, and I had a lot of room to grow because I was starting at baseline. I had no emotional language and didn't know anything about exploring feelings and what I was experiencing. And so when I learned all that, it was as if I had somebody taught me English or how to speak for the first time. And I loved it. I was on fire. So I kind of knew 2 weeks in, I was like, my path is getting ready to change in a big way, personally and professionally.
That's amazing. Wow. And so, first of all, is that when you started confronting this maybe toxic masculinity that you'd grown up experiencing to some degree? Or, sorry, I don't want to project the word toxic masculinity. You talked about the definition of masculinity.
No, I think toxic's a good fit. I'd say unconsciously, yeah. That was probably when it started. I didn't know or didn't have the language for it till probably a decade later. It was honestly 5 years ago when I started. And I was well into the helping profession at that point. I'd already a second stop. Onsite was now my thing. And that's when I really got in touch with all of me and reconciled some of the pain and rewrote some of the old messages of who I thought I was supposed to be as a man.
I feel like there is a shift that's happening right now among men. I think men are becoming a little bit more okay turning inward, and it seems like women have always been at least a few steps ahead culturally in the United States.
They have, and they still are. Onsite's numbers would show that, but it is shifting because historically women outpaced men significantly as our clientele who would come basically to a 1-week personal growth workshop.
Interesting.
And now we're starting to see more men. So it's starting to get a little bit more balance, which is great. I think the door's definitely wider for men to step into it.
That's good. That's really good. So you are like 2 weeks deep in therapy and you decide, hey, this is probably the path I'm going to go down. What kind of next steps do you take? Obviously, I would imagine you still keep on going to therapy, but what else is kind of going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I did mountains of my own work and had to explore at all angles my process and what needed to be healed. And thankfully, I had a mentor early on, and I've shared this before, but I think it's an important part of the story, as I had a mentor early on who, when I went and presented my idea, and turns out I'm not the first to do therapy and have that aha moment. It happens all the time, even at Onsite people, they had this moment of clarity and they're like, I need to be doing this.
Wow.
How to do that. And I've learned whenever that happens, and it changes, maybe 5% of the people who feel it immediately actually come back around and say, no, I'm serious. I want to be in this profession. And the rest usually it's kind of, they're on the cloud a little. But I've never discouraged one person, because the first person I went to, I got encouragement instead of redirection. And it was a game changer because I expected almost as a brand new person in the process to go to a helping professional and say, here's my business plan for starting a program. He's like, slow down a little bit, buddy. Get back in your lane, do your work. I've seen people kind of shame people in that process so much. He did not do it. What he did to me is he looked at me and he said, I believe that you have the right skill set to make an impact in the change business, the change profession. He said, but here's what I think you need to hear from my experience, is that the people who make the longest lasting impact and create sustainable change, in other words, they're here, they stick around, are the people who get a PhD in themselves. So if you want to do this, you're in the right place. Consider this, deep therapeutic work, graduate school for you to stay into this business. It was, in a sense, it was a reframe. Yeah. Because he got me back into my story.
But it was really gentle.
It was gentle. It was like, okay, so the best prep work I can do to be in this path is to do my own work.
Yeah.
And I wish therapists today and pastors and ministers today would get that message, because they don't usually get it until 15, 20 years into their career when they've face planted with burnout or addiction.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about, you were obviously going down the path of self-care, but if you're in any other profession, you can find your greatest strength by looking inward and understanding yourself better. I see people burn out all the time. It's horrible. It's so rough.
And I've even with, I feel like pretty healthy self-awareness on board, that doesn't exclude you. I mean, you can, especially if you're a driven passion junkie like me and people that we draw to Onsite. I've been at the top of my career even a few years ago and kind of crashed with burnout as the head of a place that supports people with burnout.
What does that look like then? How do you kind of reconcile that?
Thankfully, we've got a culture there where we believe in everybody professionally. We also believe there's humanness in professionals. And so we have a messy culture. We have a great culture, but it's a messy culture because we're okay with people leading with their mess and saying, this is where I struggle. It gets hard when you're the head of that, because I basically had to go into all the people who trust me, sit in front of them and say, hey, I'm not doing too well. I'm struggling relationally. I've been going too fast, too hard. I haven't really taken care of myself, and I've got to step out to be able to take care of myself in order to preserve us going forward. I was terrified to do that, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. Because you just got to think, will people trust you? Will they fall in? Will they align? Or are they going to jump ship?
Yeah.
And they didn't. I mean,
that's amazing.
I'm so lucky to have such an amazing team that I get to work with. But they actually stepped up. I learned a lot. They learned a lot because I stepped out for a little bit. Not a real long time, but I stepped out long enough that people felt empowered to do their own thing. And it was an interesting intervention or shift on the whole culture.
And so when you stepped away, what did that process look like then? How did you start kind of working back towards coming back to Onsite and recovering from that burnout?
I'm a big believer in doing intensive work when it comes to personal growth or therapeutic. I have a counselor that I do the 50-minute session with. I think that's important too. But I have a learning disability, and leave me with just a quick look and then back to something else, I've forgotten everything that I've picked up. So I need to be untethered. Honestly, that's such a huge part of what we do at Onsite, is untether people from their technology and their profession. That alone is incredibly healing.
Interesting.
And you underlay that with some pretty good therapy. It's magical. But if you didn't even do that, 2 days into being untethered from technology is healing for the human brain. But that's the way I respond the best.
That's good.
I need to jump in and do like 4 days, 8-hour days of therapy. And almost like if you calculate it out month, it'd probably be like a year's worth in a week.
Yeah.
And that's how I respond well. So that's what I did.
That's amazing.
I didn't do it at Onsite, although I do now do a program a year at Onsite, part of a leadership group that I've been doing for about a decade. I stepped out with an Onsite facilitator who I know but wasn't real close to, and we just did it at a private residence, and I did like a 4 or 5 day intensive. And
that's great. Man.
Cleaned out the cobwebs.
Yeah. And you talking about unplugging reminds me of, I guess it was probably just about a year ago now. We were in the middle of working on the good newspaper, and I had just been going a million miles an hour with so many things. And I get this email from a friend who basically says, hey, man, you want to go fishing for a week? And my natural inclination was like, no, I don't want to leave all this stuff I'm doing and take a week off to go fishing. And he's like, I basically said that back in the email, and he responded by saying, hey, he basically responded with all these things that also sound awful. Like, there's going to be no phones. We can all take a break from work. It's in Montana, like all this stuff. But I ended up saying yes. He kind of talked me into it. And what was great was that, one, it helped me realize that my job can kind of it can survive without me for a week. It was maybe a little bit of an ego check to be like, oh, I'm not as big of a deal as I think I am. Second, that just unplugging for a week, you're right, it totally changed my brain. It left me feeling refreshed and energized. It wasn't necessarily therapy, but in many ways, just the communal experience of being with some other people who are having the same experience was therapeutic. And I came back feeling energized and refreshed, and like I had just taken a deep dive for a year of therapy. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's so important, and I think we underestimate it and don't do it enough. What keeps a lot of us from doing it, I think, is when we overwork, we lose our identity in our personal life. It's usually because there's something about our personal life we're not happy with. And so people are dealing with burnout or working too much. Instead of saying, what do you love about your job? I say, what are you missing at home?
Oh, that's good.
And if you can explore that, it can be a challenging process, but if you can explore it, then home gets to be driven by the same passion that work gets to be driven by, and that's where kind of organic balance comes from.
That's beautiful. I've never heard anybody describe it like that. That's so interesting. And then, so after you ask that question, what do you do when you ask that question and somebody doesn't know the answer, if they don't necessarily have something that immediately comes to mind?
Well, and I don't do the clinical work because I'm usually running it, I will do triage and some coaching. So if I were working with somebody, or let's just say it's a buddy, and we're trying to help figure out what's going on, I would simply just get curious about and ask questions, because ultimately, what work does for me, it fills up a part of I'm chasing a hole that I still have in my soul, that it's not near as big as it used to be. But I do get some unconscious need met by being in my profession, the helping profession. You can call that codependent, you can call that all this other stuff, and I've worked on all that stuff. But I think it's more dangerous when you don't know it. Now that I know it, I've kind of got peace with it. People are surprised when I tell them that. They think I need to evolve beyond it. But I think everybody has that at some level. If you're in a helping profession or in ministry, or even if you're just an entrepreneur that's driven to scale impact and do good things socially, I feel like there's some need you're getting met. And so it's just trying to keep that in check. It's okay as long as you know it, but figure out what you're chasing that you're not getting somewhere else.
It's that self-awareness.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. What is your ultimate hope that people can come out of an Onsite, or even just, anything regarding your work? Like, what's your hope for people to leave with?
I think it'd be just greater self-awareness. I think when people live in a space of understanding where their story comes from, where some of the imprint happened that might be giving them a message that may or may not be true, you can live in grace in a deeper way. And so hopefully I would hope people would be anchored in their worth because they're aware and they're living in grace. And I think when the world feels solid and grounded in who they are, who we are as individuals, and we're more awake to how people around us are responding, that's where you see big change happen. And I think there's a big deficit of it in our culture right now, politically and spiritually, and even in the psychology community too. There's really a lack of self-exploration and self-awareness.
You just use the phrase living in grace. Can you break down what that means a little bit more, how that can be a response or a follow-up to self-awareness?
I think we're culturally conditioned to look and feel a certain way in order to fit in, because the culture moves so fast, and it's planting all these seeds of division everywhere based on belief systems and who we are and what we look like in the color of our skin. That's been going on for a long time, but I still think there's still a big undertone of it. And grace for me is when you can be yourself fully in a community of different and live wholly in that space without the hustle. there's an easiness to it. There's a solidness, and I know grace has spiritual definitions and all, but for me, it's just really having permission to be who you are and allowing other people to be who they are.
You're somebody who is ambitious and has started things. You've started Onsite, and I know you've had some other entrepreneurial endeavors. And for me, I know, once I have an idea up and running, because I'm very much the same way, my brain is already moving on to the next exciting idea of how I can, do what I'm already doing better, or how I can take my existing skills and abilities and try something different. What does that look like for you as Onsite has been doing? Well, I would imagine you've got new ideas on things that you can take action on with your skills and expertise. What's that looking like?
Right now, one of the things I'm most excited about is we're launching a podcast, myself and a dear friend, Ruthie Lindsay, which is a mutual friend.
Yeah, and I would imagine that almost everybody listening to this episode has heard Ruthie's episode on our podcast. It was one of our first and one of our most popular of all time. Everybody loves Ruthie.
It's Ruthie. She's amazing. So Ruthie and I have this unique relationship, and it's surprisingly somewhat new, but if you know Ruthie, that she doesn't do new relationships. You become fast friends with her quickly, but we kind of have this yin and yang thing, and it's a kind of a brother-sister. We're doing a podcast called Unspoken, and it's why saying the unsaid may be the hardest and most important thing we'll ever do. So it's just supporting people in speaking hard truth.
I'm so
Similar
excited.
to some of what you've been able to do. You paved the way for people like us to come behind you. Just having having a podcast with depth.
Thank you.
And we want to do the same thing and share some of our friends with the world. So we're probably a few weeks away from launching that, and excited about it.
Good. Man, I'm so pumped about that. And Ruthie's self-awareness and her story, and something really beautiful about her is just the way that she uses that to connect with others. She can really, like, we were in Boston together and we went out for drinks after an event that we were both at, and I go to the bathroom and I come back and she's already heard this entire life story of our waiter.
That's
and
Ruthie.
Just somehow she's able to connect with all these aspects of their life. And so I love that we're getting that her just genuine life experience met with your expertise together in something.
It's a fun combo. So I'm super excited about that. I can't wait for you guys to hear some of the conversations we've had so far. And then I'm working on a book too that I'll share more about later, but it's going to be a fun year.
Oh, that's so fun. And what I love is that with both of those things, you're just taking things that are really high level that, somebody in your field would be really familiar with, but people outside of that field may not be, and you're able to just put new language on that and put it in a helpful format where it can actually change people's lives and it's not stuck in a textbook.
Yes, and I don't want to diminish the work and the credentialing in the education of psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists. I love them. I mean, I work with so many of them, but it's not their job to brand what they do so that it's digestible for our culture.
Exactly.
And that's what you're doing. That's what I want to do, is more people need to speak up about their process and help take this conversation mainstream and out of psych hospitals and therapy rooms.
I think that's so important. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently too, is I've been operating mostly from my own personal experiences. And as I get a little bit further into this podcast or the newspaper or these other projects I'm working on, I'm finding myself turning to experts and trying to learn from them, because I feel like, I'll always be learning from my own experience, but there's so much to be learned from people who are a million steps beyond what I'm capable of.
And I love what you're doing with the paper. One of the things you're doing, because you're actually reporting stories of redemption and grace and people who are doing good things in the world, which that's the story that doesn't get told. I think you're an early adopter like I am. That's going to eventually sell. It doesn't sell in the news cycle now because everybody thinks that you've got to have drama in a pain point and in a story for it to actually work. And to some level, people smarter than us at study story. They're right, but there's also an element of good in the world that people are hungry for.
Yeah.
And I think your paper is going to take off.
Thank you. And the science really is interesting in that people are naturally more drawn to bad news, but the truth is it should never stop with that bad news. And I think it's important to know the heartbreaking things that are happening in the world, but the cool thing is, for every heartbreaking thing that happens in the world, there's somebody who's being affected by it who has decided to take action to solve that problem, to end that pain for other people. And so we don't end the story until we've talked about that part of things.
Love that. So you're telling the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
You just got me thinking about a question I had, and what do people do when they leave Onsite? You know, they're coming away feeling changed and energized and excited, but they're going back to their normal life. What do you send them out with? Like, what's the call to action after you get back home?
Yeah, hopefully we've shifted the paradigm for them internally about 2 degrees. Instead of, I think a lot of change initiatives want to completely rewrite people's story, and we're not big on a confrontational intervention on what people don't have going on well in their life. It's more of change is an inside job, and if you can support, I think everybody's got every tool that they possibly need to create the change in their life if they have an experience and a safe way to process it. So we spend as much time on curating emotional safety in our environment as we do facilitating clinical modalities. Curating emotional safety gives people this opportunity to operate within this bubble of unconditional grace and love, which doesn't exist out in our families and our relationships and in our world. But you can create that, and to live in that bubble for a week, if it does anything, it just changes you at your core, and you walk away more empathetic, more empathetic towards humanity and towards yourself. It doesn't always stick. You get back into life and you realize reality is going to hit again, and the rest of the world doesn't operate that. But I love to tell people when they're there, I was like, the world may not feel like this to you, but you're going to begin to feel like this to the world. And I think that's what you see. I love when people see people who come home from an on-site type experience and say, I see something different in you. And that person doesn't go have to advertise, here are all the things I changed. It's just that subtly people notice that there's been some kind of shift at their core.
What's going to happen to the United States or to the world when more and more people are having these types of experiences, when more and more people are becoming self-aware? Let's talk specifically the United States. What do you think will culturally change?
I can sit with people at this point in my life who I disagree with in a big way, whether it's their theology or their faith or their politics, or you could even take my industries. There's 1,000 different ways to support people in change, and we get hooked in our own dogma too, just like the faith-based communities do. I can sit with a lot of different viewpoints and hold them all and be in good conversation with them and honestly listen. So I guess I could say that if more empathy is on board and more self-awareness is on board in the United States as a culture, I think we will all listen to one another better and deeper.
As you were talking, I was kind of checking myself because my natural inclination in 2018 with the political state that we're in is almost to think that when people become more empathetic, they all share the same opinions on how the world should work. Because sometimes when you look out, you see one political party that seems more empathetic than another political party. But what I'm hearing from you is that you can be across the political spectrum to some degree, and people can be emotionally healthy, and that just allows us to have better conversations with each other and to maybe find better solutions by talking with people we disagree with. Does that sound at all accurate?
It does, and I know we're talking at like 10,000 feet. It would be fun to drill down and look at it, but I could see where we could land on, based on how a political party is branded, that they might care more about humanity. But empathy is a two-way street. It's not just how much you care about the world, it's how much you care about yourself. And so you'd say the other party's a little bit more self-indulgent. You could say that, but that's a portion of empathy too. One without the other creates a problem. And so it's right-sizing both and realize that we have to take care of ourselves in order to take care of other people. We can't give it all away, and we can't take it all. But empathy, I think, universal empathy gets us not all agreeing, but at least hearing different points of view. Because I would be considered, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but I have political aspirations. Maybe in 10 or 15 years, if things position themselves well, only because I'm passionate about what I'm seeing that's not getting done. And I think in politics, vulnerability and empathy in leadership is missing. It's abstinent. I've never seen a debate where somebody said, I don't know, or said, you know what, that particular area that you're asking me about, it's not my strong suit, but I'm going to surround myself. Here's what I'm doing about it. It's always a spin. It doesn't matter if you know it or not. You got to know something. So say whatever comes out of your mouth. And I think if any leader ever stood up and said, I don't know, or I struggle with this, the humanness of what we all know they have, I would trust them to the end of the earth.
Really?
And it's not like I want to become president, but I think Congress and Senate, a little bit of influence to support people in knowing what they don't know instead of standing firm in what they do know, whether they know it or not, could shift the whole paradigm.
Wow. First of all, that's so exciting, and I'm so excited to vote for you in 10 or 15 years.
Man.
Second of all, you've got the hair for it, so that's great. But third of all, like, I want to believe you, and I think I do. Like, I see that for myself. I'm like, yeah, I would 100% trust a person who's willing to say, I don't know. But when I think about the presidential debates that happened, during the 2016 election, I can't imagine one of the candidates, or let's pretend they're different candidates, a candidate in the way that our country is right now saying, I don't know, and then not getting just destroyed on, cable news or talk radio. What about all the people who aren't self-aware enough in the country to acknowledge that as something that's to be valued?
It's going to take a big shift. It's not like, you're exactly right, you would get crushed because certainty sells. I mean, that's why there's mega churches on every corner. Certainty sells, and certainty sells in politics, but it's dangerous. I think it's like being an iPhone that never gets an update. And I think we as human beings have to be updated and constantly reprogrammed and be open, hands up to what we think we know. Because if we get so anchored in our belief systems that we lose perspective on everybody else's, then that's when wars and everything else start. And I think vulnerability sells too. I think we've seen that. I think one good example of it is my friend Brene Brown's work. It's taken off in leadership circles right now that people don't even know about. I mean, the people she's consulting at a high level is remarkable, and it's trickling down. And she's not one that's going to stand on a platform and say, "You're not going to believe who I just worked with," but she's working with them. And her book, people grabbed her book in mainstream culture, not just a helping profession. That book crossed all kinds of barriers. Her TED Talk. So she's just one example because I give her credit a lot of time for bringing vulnerability up to the surface. But it's getting trendy. It's popular. That's why people are going to therapy and coaching and counseling right now. And I think it will get that way in the media too.
Wow. So what do we do to bridge that gap then? What are, the stepping stones between what Brene Brown did and eventually having a presidential candidate who says, I don't know, and seeing the American public embrace that I don't know?
I'd say practice it. That's the best way, is to mirror the behavior you wish to see. It would make no sense at all for a future Senate candidate to be sitting here talking on something that's going to live online for a long time about my depression and anxiety. That makes no sense because you could shoot holes in that. I mean, if a candidate got a hold of that, I can see a commercial now saying this guy went, blah. And I'm very open about it and I'm okay about it. Guess what? The last 4 presidents all had a lot of challenges too, mental health and other areas. Some of them talked about it, some of them didn't. Sometimes we had to find out through the back door. But I think we just do it. I'm taking the risk now to put all of me out there. And at some point, I think the world's going to be ready to embrace it.
Man, I'm so excited. And this podcast is going to go viral in about 15 years.
I don't think that many people care yet about me, but thank you.
Man, this is so exciting. I guess maybe now is just a good time to kind of wrap this up by saying, for somebody who, isn't necessarily in a place to take a week off, though, they're probably hoping for it, waiting for it. If somebody just wants to go out and take action this week or this month to grow in self-awareness, where would you say that people should start? And maybe even, what's something that people aren't necessarily already thinking about?
If you are just part of the worried well, which is all of us, you don't have major trauma in your life or a lot going on, then be intentional about community. Be as intentional about community as you are about work. And community can be fishing with buddies. It could be anything that supports you taking time for you is not arrogant. It's not narcissistic. It's not egotistical. It's important. So it could be meditation, it could be prayer, it could be church, it could be therapy, it could be coaching, counseling. It comes in a lot of different forms, but just make sure you're doing something intentionally, contribute to who you are, where you've been, and who you're becoming. Speaking to the people out there that are in a lot of pain, and I know there's a lot of you, statistically it's 1 in 4 that are dealing with something, depression and anxiety or abuse at some point along the spectrum. I guess the most important thing for them is knowing that you're not alone. And this is not the last chapter of your story. We're seeing that happen too much now. I've seen people's stories end, suicides at an all-time high, and it breaks my heart because I've seen so many people who have been at that place. I've seen so many people who've been standing on the edge of a canyon looking down to what would be the end of their story, and they're doing incredible now. 1 year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. I can't tell you the number of stories I've seen with people in darkness who are now embracing light. And so that's the story I would want, or the message I would want to share if you're out there stuck, struggling, and in pain and struggling with mental health is speak up. It's 100% okay. It's admirable. It's your strength. And you will turn that into your superpower. What you don't know right now if you're sitting in depression and anxiety is you're sitting on the biggest opportunity that most people wish they'll have at some point. Because people now, when they call me and they're like, oh man, I'm losing this. This is falling apart. I just got exposed here. There's a little part of me that has to contain myself with an appropriate response because I'm kind of excited for them. As long as I know that they're going to get help in some way. And there's a lot of ways you can get help now online. There's anonymous support groups. There's all kinds of counseling and therapy. Not everybody can afford or do an on-site experience, and that's okay. Just do something. Put your hands out. And you'll be surprised about how people are going to come around you. And you'll be surprised at what this part of your story is going to do to launch you forward in an amazing way.
Wow, Miles is such a cool guy. I admire his honesty and his transparency. And after this conversation, I want to really lean into this idea that when you find authentic, non-performance-based, messy community that embraces all of you, not just the shiny good part, that is when you've made it home. Let's not forget that Miles kind of announced for the first time ever that he'll be running for public office in the future. And I'm just going to lay my cards on the table and tell you now that I will be voting for him. If you want to learn more about Miles and follow his important work, definitely find him on Twitter and Instagram at Miles Adcox. And for sure, be on the lookout for his upcoming podcast release with our friend Ruthie Lindsay. It's called Unspoken, and I am counting down the days until that comes out. And lastly, check out Miles' work at Onsite at onsiteworkshops.com. If you're new to Sounds Good, we would love for you to stick around. If you enjoyed this conversation, you'd also love our conversation with photographer Jeremy Cowart and world-traveling storyteller BC Serta. You can find both of these episodes and more than 100 other episodes by searching Sounds Good wherever you listen to podcasts. This podcast is created by me, Brandon Harvey, as a part of Good, 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 a community that believes in the power of celebrating good news and becoming good news. Chad Michael-Snavely and the team at CM Studio edit and mix the show, and Christy Karen Brock offers production support. You can get lots of hopeful stories on social media by following us everywhere at GoodGoodGoodCO. And remember, good news isn't dead. My team and I have set out to prove this by creating a beautiful quarterly newspaper that celebrates the people, ideas, and movements that are shaping the world for the better. And we've got some really exciting news. Issue 4 is almost here. We just printed the brand new issue. We Instagrammed the whole thing, and you can pre-order it today. Check it out and see what else we do at GoodGoodGood at goodgoodgood.co. And with that, that is a wrap for this week's episode. Go out and remember that maybe one of the most important things you can offer this world is getting a PhD in yourself. Sound good?